I'm James. I'm what's known as the co-founder of Sociocracy 3.0, simply because myself and Bernard Bockelbrink, who I developed or discovered S3 with, decided to call ourselves that. Seems to be the thing that you do, but I don't really lay any claim to the content that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I see very much my mission in life really to just pass on awesome things that have been introduced to me and I've found value in certain contexts. And so I spend my time going around the world sharing them with anyone else who might find that valuable too. Also, anything I say is not the truth, it's just a perspective. You have your own. So I put everything here before you and you can pick and choose if it resonates and makes sense with you. Sounds so strange. It's like I'm plugged into the mains or something. Okay. So my presentation today, well, just to give you a little bit of introduction first, I want to mention Liliana David here, along with Bernard Bockelbrink, because the three of us are what's known as co-developers of S3. So we invest our time, it's in our own time, we're volunteers, and we put this together, kind of evolve the guide. And I'm going to share something about Sociocracy 3.0 today and give some kind of generic but practical examples of what we see happening with that in the world. But I also want to take a different tangent today. So we'll come to it in a moment. But before I get down to this, I know I'm in Sweden, so you've probably heard of this word before, democracy. Can you raise your hand if you haven't heard of democracy before? Can you raise your hands if you're concerned about the state of democracy, whatever that is, in the world today? Yeah, me too. Well, sociocracy, it sounds a bit like democracy, right? And sociocracy basically means it's like a philosophy, it's a mindset where the people affected by decisions can make and influence those decisions on the basis of reason to do so. And S3, till recently, the S3 framework, but it was never a framework, so we booted that out. It's basically a practical guide, a bunch of patterns, practices, definitions, and guidelines for behavior that are useful for certain people in certain contexts some of the time. And there's a menu of patterns, there's around 70. These are kind of pattern categories. You don't have to take it all in, but I put at the center co-creation and evolution because in essence this is what it's about. They're patterns to enable people to be able to collaborate effectively together. So, on to the difficult to pronounce title for my talk today. It's not either or, it's both and more. Sociocracy 3.0 and patterns to transcend duality. Cool, huh? I've been invested in this topic for almost 20 years. This idea of beyond duality. We could call it triune consciousness. And I'm going to say a little bit today, share a bit of my journey with this and why it became relevant in my life, and maybe offer you the possibility of understanding why it's relevant in yours as well. And when Jeff asked me to come to the conference, this was in the summer, and I was on a much-needed vacation, so I just ignored the email. Sorry, Jeff. And in the autumn, he pinged me. He said, "Hey, man, do you think you could come? Do you think you could come still?" And I said, "Oh, sure. Sorry, I just ditched the mail." And I asked him, "What do you want me to talk about?" He said, "Anything you like." And I thought, that's awesome. I can talk about anything I like. So I double-checked with him. I even ran the title past you, right? And he said, "Well, it sounds intriguing." Like all good ideas, the part of me that had the idea disappeared and left the rest of me to figure out how to do it. And like is often my pattern, I left it until the last minute yesterday at around 11 o'clock in the morning. So the last 24 hours I've been putting together a new presentation. I've tested the concept previously, it's my MVP and I'm going to run it past you. I did kind of go to code while I went to Graphio and spent about 18 hours putting this together. And I've also plugged in a previous section of a presentation that I made recently at Agile People as well, just to give you some kind of context around S3 itself. And this is a kind of personal journey for me, so also the last 24 hours I've been kind of reflecting on my selves. And on that topic, I'd just like to acknowledge two of the most impactful teachers in my life, a couple called Hal and Sidra Stone, who from the 70s have developed a methodology called voice dialogue. Nothing to do with singing, but much more about meeting inner parts of ourselves. It's based on this assumption that the psyche is multiple. I don't know, think when you go for a job interview versus when you're with a new beloved. Don't you behave differently? Well, I mean, it depends on the job interview, of course. But generally speaking, everything I say today is just in general, right? There's always an exception to the norm. Okay, so inner voice dialogue is an exploration of the psychology of selves. And I'm going to use myself as a case example to convey what it is I want to share with you. So, it's a story of me. It's only a story because there's many stories of me, and believe me, some of them I'm not going to talk about with you today. They're private for now. But something we share in common, you and me, is that we are all born unique and vulnerable. It's not so easy to remember the early days, but if you think about it, at that time, pre-birth, post-birth, for those early months, years, we were really dependent on those around us to take care of our well-being. In fact, if we don't adapt according to the cultural, familial, societal, environmental context, then we die. So we are thoroughly reliant on making a good impression, thoroughly reliant on being cared for, and having our basic needs met. And you know, one of my early strategies for doing that was I learned to please. My mum, she was quite vulnerable as a mother. She was 26. She came from a background of having to be very responsible. She also had some horrific experiences in her childhood, which made her aim to be more mature than her years, perhaps. But underneath, she was also very vulnerable. And whilst I can't remember cognitively this experience, I know now that it was true that if she was vulnerable and I was less than happy, then something about our connection diminished. It's like she would take back the energy. She would be more concerned somehow in herself. And you know, newborn children, they are profoundly sensitive to contact. You are profoundly sensitive to contact. And when it goes, we know it, even though maybe we can't see on the surface what it is that's happening. And the pleaser is that part of us that picks up when the energy cuts and aims to bring back the contact. My father was away the first year. I was the first son. And any eldest siblings here? Oh, quite a few. Maybe there's something about Agile conferences and eldest siblings, I don't know. But it's most likely to take responsibility for the family. We're like the experiment, no? I don't know, got younger siblings and you thought, God, it's just so unfair because they got such a better deal than we did. And there's these stories like, oh, you have to take care of things, you're the eldest, you need to set an example, you should know better, and blah. I can hear them all introjected into the bowels of my psyche. So a responsible parent to take care of my mother. Also, a kind of warrior perfectionist, because there were rules in my family. There were rules, and I needed to get them right. And even though I was that big and couldn't walk or speak or anything else, there were still rules, and I could sense that they were there, because if I made the mistake, then the connection was less, and if I got it right, the connection was more. So from a very young age, I was very invested in getting things right, whatever that means. And a bit later, I started to think about these things and developed an understanding mind. The understanding mind kind of lives here. I was up out of the body somewhere in the cognitive space, and it's not particularly connected to the body, to the feet. Understanding mind doesn't have any genitals. And a knower. Because my understanding mind understood that it would understand things once it understood them. And my knower knew this. It's like the data bank, yeah, that records the information. It knew stuff. And my knower knew a lot. One other one, I remember my mother in the morning, she'd come into my bedroom, she'd say, "Come on, chop, chop, out of bed." I'd be like, what? Come on, up you get, come on, what are you doing today? I'd get home in the afternoon, she'd say, "What did you do today?" Not, "How are you today?" Not, "How did you feel today?" Yeah? What did you do today? So I learned a lot about getting on with things, about doing things, about achieving things. And I also quite rapidly internalized the external criticism that I experienced in the environment around me, the kind of rules. And as a kid, I was quite self-conscious. I was much more self-focused than focused to others. And finally, to kind of keep an eye on everything, I developed, this is like a system of selves actually, this protector, controller kind of system that kept everything in line. And part of that was a part that sat right in front of me like a big steel wall and would make sure that you couldn't get in here unless it was absolutely safe for me. So, this is what Hal and Sidra call the primary selves. This is just a few, yeah, and it's not the truth, yeah, but it reflects aspects of me. And maybe you have your own childhood story, and maybe you recognize that certain behaviors were more acceptable in your life context than others. Now, the problem with identifying with these ways of being is that it comes at a cost. So, the cost of identifying with pleasing others is we don't necessarily learn about how to please ourselves. You don't have to raise your hands, but does anyone have experience of that? Yeah. Or the cost of learning to take care of others no matter what. It's that if no one else can deal with it, I'll take care of it, don't worry energy. It's the I'll burn out in 30 years from now, but meanwhile I'm going to take care of everything. Identification with this energy kills people early. And the compromise is self-care. From this perspective, it's selfish, no? Oh, you're so selfish. I can hear the message, again, introjected into my psyche. But selfish, self-care, let's not throw babies out with the bathwater. Another one, the warrior, perfectionist. I mean, what's perfect? There's developers in the room, right? What's perfect? Yeah. And on the other side, this openness, like the student of life. Anything is possible. Or understanding mind. Compromising body wisdom. My Noah, I was so arrogant as a kid. I was so arrogant as a young adult. I can still be arrogant today, but I kind of do it shamelessly now. And along the way, I discovered humility. You know, there was a woman once, she was a teacher of mine, and I wanted to come and present stuff like this. This was like 15 years ago. I was training as an integrative counselor. I was on a 3-year course in this institute, and I was telling her why it would be good I came and presented around this. And she listened to me, and at the end she said, "James, it sounds great, but I want to know, where's your humility?" I was so ashamed. I was so destroyed, and in the moment, you know what I did? What he did? He went on to explain to her why I didn't have any humility. I even knew that. Isn't that amazing? But underneath, I was dying of shame, and for 2 years, I could barely think of anything else except that. And in those 2 years, I learned about humility. Such a relief to embrace not knowing. Oh my God. You know, suddenly anything is possible. Suddenly lifelong learning is possible. And there's none so foolish as those who believe they know. Pusher, achiever. Well, I had to go into therapy to discover this character. Being. Yeah, to be human beings, not just human doings. And on the other side of the critic, interestingly, I disowned my judge. A judge has a positive essence, we'll come back to it later, but discernment. I had no capacity for discernment because in moments of vulnerability and anxiety, then everything was to do with me. Yeah, I was my biggest critic. And on the other side of this protector-controller system was this super cute, really lovely, open, friendly, free child that again took me a lot of personal work to really reconnect with, to a point where I could feel kind of safe enough and connected enough to that, to let it be a part of my life. It chose my shirt this morning and my jeans. Check it out. He was like, "You can't wear jeans like that to a conference like this." It's like, why not? So, critic and judge, they're kind of unique characters, the critic and the judge, because you know what they do? They take the rule system of whichever other self it is and enforce it. Either be like that or don't be like that. And the basic premise of the critic is, I'm profoundly not okay and you're okay. Yeah. And the premise of the judge is, I'm okay and it's you that's not okay. The truth is, we're all okay in the context of doing our best with whatever we've learned and whatever we have. And the worst position is this idea, nobody and nothing is okay. Again, critics kill people. You know, critics help grow cancer faster. Critics inflict people with the dis-ease of shame. And it's not like intentionally to be bad or to kill people, it's just to kind of get in there first and make the criticism that one time we heard outside so that we can adjust our behavior before somebody criticizes us from the outside. And the judge is when there's too much of that. Yes, identify with the judge instead and let someone else feel that pain and shame rather than us. So, if we look at the whole system, a simplification of my system, we can see there's this general identification with certain parts and a general disidentification with other parts. This is me, and that's not me. And Hal and Sidra called this the primary selves and the disowned selves. Now, the critic, along with the protector controller, enforces the rules of the system. The judge too, looking outward, determining what not to be, and basically upholds the rule system to keep us safe. That's the intention. But if we look behind judgment, if we look behind these rules, we start to see something very interesting. Because behind judgment is an insight into what we've disowned. It's very easy to confuse discernment with judgment and say, oh, well, this person really is just an arsehole. But if there's any charge, just the slightest little or then it might be worth taking a look to ask, what is it that's happening to me? What rule in me is dominating, and what is it I'm seeing out there that I'm seeking to avoid experiencing in myself? Judgment can be positive. Has anyone in this room ever fallen in love? Can you raise your hand if you've fallen in love? Isn't it just awesome? I mean, it's just the most beautiful, delicious, wonderful, maddening, encapsulating experience possible. Has anyone in here ever fallen out of love? How did that happen? Did you make a mistake? You know that person that you were so attracted to and that you shared so many experiences with? Was it really from the beginning they were so horrible? Or was it that at some point in the course of the relationship something happened, there was a vulnerability, and suddenly you kind of polarized back into your unique positions, and it just turned out that a lot of that attraction was the attraction of opposites, and you'd fallen in love with your disowned selves. And really, it doesn't matter whether the judgment is positive or negative, it reveals the same thing. If we go behind and ask, what's the rule, who's judging, what am I identified with, we start to build a conscious relationship with our inner parenting system. I'm going to tie all this into why this is relevant in an Agile conference. and organizations, by the way, yeah? You didn't suddenly turn up in some psychospiritual conference or something. Really? This is my challenge to myself in the 21 minutes remaining. So, something I learned as a therapist working for 10 years, and also 400 hours of personal experimentation with the process of discovering about my inner selves. It was like awesome, epic adventure. I was just so blown by myself. Yeah. Is this realization it's really important to honor the primary selves. It's really important to recognize that those parts of me, these parts of me, were there for a really good reason once upon a time. Not necessarily a good reason in my daily life today always, but in my earlier childhood, they were the best effort I could make to getting through my life and getting my basic needs met. Exactly the same for you. Different selves. Maybe you're more over here. I don't know. I fell in love with women who were like the opposite. Profoundly opposite. They were my greatest teachers. But honor the primaries. Yeah, there's a good reason why people behave the way they do, and there's a good reason why selves in us take hold of the system. Yeah, the reason is taking care of the child, the vulnerability. Now, voice dialogue's pretty cool. I really like it. It's working with the field of relational energetics. Relational energetics is based on this assumption that we are all interconnected, and that in the field, between the molecules of our apparently solid form, we are in resonance within ourselves and with each other. Have you ever walked into a room and you get there's people there and you get a sense of, oh, there's something going down in the space. Yeah, it doesn't feel good, or it feels great, or it feels strange, or it feels, yeah. We're sensing these things all the time. There's so much more going on than we ever are conscious of. And it's got a lot to do with this character, actually, this vulnerable child, because the thing about vulnerability is exquisite openness to all life. Yeah? To be vulnerable is just to be open to be affected. And to be totally vulnerable is to be open to everything. And what voice dialogue does is it's a facilitated process where somebody basically hangs out and chats, or sometimes not talking, just being with different parts of the psyche. So my understanding mind, if this were a voice dialogue session, he'd be here and he'd be telling you all about himself because he understands himself and he understands this content. And I've been really invested in this the last 24 hours, and I was really thinking about what to say, and I've accrued a lot of information about this, and I'm thinking, how am I going to share it with these people? And I'm super... And he can go on and on and on. He's like a processor. Having explored that on the other side, sorry, I should do it the other way around. On the other side, the facilitator might invite me to move over, and I experience this body wisdom state. I even have to bring in someone else to speak because there's just no words here. This is just in the earth. Now, in the process of becoming conscious of identifications like this, we also become more conscious of the vulnerability that's served by these characters. And so the voice dialogue process is basically a process of becoming aware of and then ultimately disidentifying with parts of ourselves that are trying to take care of this unconsciously. And in order to do that, we have to develop a more conscious relationship with vulnerability. We have to learn to embrace it in a more conscious way so characters like this can relax. And interestingly, a lot of what helps with that is what we disowned on the other side. So for me, for example, I can just trip out in my own imagination with this guy. And when I'm feeling vulnerable, I might try and explain myself, bring in the knower, bring in the perfectionist, bring in the pleaser, and just try and tell you this thing you need to hear so it's all going to be okay. And sometimes it's just not going to be okay. Whereas when I can bring in what's on the other side, it enables me to stand on 2 feet somehow. I'm more balanced. Aware ego process is basically the process of learning to stand between apparently irreconcilable opposites and in that place of centeredness connected to vulnerability, to discover what wants to emerge. And over time, with work, we can learn to reclaim ourselves, to become more whole, more complete. It's interesting because I'm who I am, right? And you're who you are. So it's quite a trip to consider, well, who I believe I am is only part of what I am. And it's, in a dual universe, it's just standing on one leg. It's just an identification with aspects of me, but there's a whole other side that maybe hasn't got expression at all. And as I said earlier, the positive essence of criticism and judgment is self-reflection and discernment. But until we really bring consciousness to our identifications, it's very difficult to accurately self-reflect and very difficult to discern. But when we do, realization and choice becomes more emergent. In a dual universe, choice is something we make. In a triune universe, choice is realization in each moment because there's just a sense of rightness. This is it, here, now, this moment. It's like budgeting, yeah? Versus navigating via tension in the moment. So, what about organizations? Well, organizations don't have a vulnerable child, but they are vulnerable to be impacted. And there's lots of things needed in organization, the same as there are in human beings. And there's also lots of people in organizations. And organizations tend to have a lot of stuff going on. Dealing with different things, different needs, needs within needs, within needs, within needs. And more or less, the people take care of it. And something interesting happens as organizations grow, a bit like when I grew too. Like a pretty traditional dualistic way of doing it is with some kind of protector-controller system that takes care of things. I mean, I heard questions in the last two presentations around why is it that we keep falling back on this paradigm. Well, our psyches fall back on this paradigm. It's like we manage our lives by surrendering to some kind of pyramidic command and control system and compromise half of what we are. And a question I've been asking myself for many years now is there a both and more? Not just internally for us in our intrapsychic organization, but externally in organizations that we are part of. Basically, in the biggest sense, us as a species and how we collaborate together. Is there another way? So, quick 101 on S3, for those of you who haven't captured this previously. There's 7 principles that kind of guide the patterns of S3. And there's many principles that guide the patterns, like love, respect, integrity. But 7 that we decided to name were equivalents, which is kind of like the word sociocracy. People affected by decisions being the ones to make and influence those decisions. Like I was facilitating in my inner world as I allowed some of the members of the organization previously excluded to get involved in decision making. Consent. Do things in the absence of reason not to. And consider when there's reasons not to do things, to do it differently. Transparency, we've covered. Accountability, like do what we've agreed to and be accountable for the overall kind of strategy of the organization. Empiricism and continuous improvement, hopefully don't need to say much about that in an Agile conference. And effectiveness, like only working on that which brings us closer to our objectives. And one concept from S3 is this idea of driver. It's the motive responding to a situation. And a simple way to describe drivers is a brief statement: what's happening, what's needed. Like when I was a kid, mum's energy is withdrawn, I'm super freaked out, I need to smile to get some kind of attention. Basic strategy. In an organizational context, an example of a driver, we're creating waste, developing some unnecessary features based on speculation. We need to agree on ways to validate assumptions earlier. Has anyone come across this driver? Who'd have thunked it? Okay. Yeah, so we as human beings, it's all we do our whole lives is respond to drivers. Things happening, things needed. Yeah. And if it's relevant for us in our context, do something. It's not rocket science. So in organizations I see pulling in patterns from S3, they do things which make a lot of sense, which is basically, like, when become aware of needs in the organization, is to make sure either that it's dealt with there and then, or that the people that need to know, the people with the capacity to influence, get that information and can do something about it. So in S3, we talk about clarifying domains. Yeah, so people have an idea who does what. We also make a distinction between governance and operations. Governance is like deciding on what to do to respond to drivers and setting constraints, and operations is just doing it. And we can do that as groups of people, in teams, in circles, and we can do that as individuals in roles if we do that kind of thing. One thing that I find quite interesting is this question, is it really something I need to talk to somebody else about, or can we just do it? Yeah. So sometimes there's really value in tapping collective intelligence. You know, that's what I found in my intrapsychic organizations. Sometimes it makes sense to get other people on board. If my pusher did it his way all the time, I would probably have died by now, because my pusher would keep going without stopping. But when I invite being into the space, and when I invite the self-care into the space, I get a very different picture to how I might if I'm just identified with doing and getting shit done. So sometimes it makes sense to involve others in the picture. And other times it makes sense to just do it. Another characteristic of sociocracy in general is this idea of collaborative decision-making, where basically there's a move from a manager making decisions, or a lead kind of taking governance decisions that affect others, and shifting things to the circle instead. It's usually a relief for everybody, including somebody who previously was in this position, because you get the added value of all that collective intelligence from everybody else, and you suddenly get shared ownership over what's happening, instead of decisions that are more or less well mandated and are more or less successful in the long run. So I'm not going to go into this in detail right now, but I just wanted to kind of break it down a bit in terms of different dimensions in organizations. So agreeing. In S3, people generally see it makes sense to clarify why we're making a decision before deciding. I don't know why that might make sense in our world today. And co-creating agreements together. And this idea of good enough for now, safe enough to try agreements. It's like agile governance, you know? Prototype, test it, learn from experience, and build as you go. Don't try up front to get it all right. And experiment and learn. Enable maximum autonomy. In my opinion, good governance should lead to less governance by groups of people together. I think it makes sense for us to make decisions to free people up to get on with stuff as much as possible for themselves. One other thing is, on this topic of domains and passing drivers to people most able to respond, the weird thing is that there's this kind of meme I see these days about flat organizations and about people being free and doing whatever they want to do, and stop telling me what to do. And there's a big problem with this. One, because generally most of us haven't actually matured in ourselves to the point where we are fully able to do that. And two, because without some kind of coherence, especially at scale, we end up reinventing the wheel, we end up doing double work, we end up creating impediments elsewhere, and so on and so forth. So in order to be more free, we also need more clarity on structure, sometimes. And so very often in organizations that we're working with, one of the first things that they tend to do is pull in a domain description where they define the driver for that domain, key responsibilities, constraints, preferred quality, skills, experience. And regular feedback and review to help the people who are responding there to learn and grow and become more awesome. And this really enables agility at scale. Because once the domains are clear, people can flow information and influence where it needs to go. We could say flow information and power, right? Influence is just power, by another word. Link between domains when necessary and discover the kind of organizational structure that wants to emerge. If you look at an organization that's navigating via tension in this way, people identifying drivers like nerve endings of the system, responding to them directly or pulling in others when necessary or passing them to others when it makes more sense for them to do it themselves, we start to see this kind of organic process. This is not a reorg, no? This is just an organization. Oops. This is just an organization that's constantly adapting to changes in the environment. Yeah. And one pattern I wanted to share with you, I was trying to think, how do I tie this into psychology of selves? But there's a lot of organizations I see today, startups particularly, and they're saying, we don't want to do a hierarchy, but how do we deal with those big organization-wide drivers, you know, the things that concern the whole system? And so one pattern I'm quite excited about, and others seem to be too, is this idea of delegate circle. It's just the people doing the work, selecting representatives to come together and make good enough for now, safe enough to try decisions together in response to the drivers that concern them. Selecting people to roles on the strength of the reason. That's like me in a moment when I can be conscious instead of just acting out of my habits and check in with the different parts of me. What's going to be most appropriate here right now, considering the circumstances? Sometimes the habitual knee-jerk character isn't the most appropriate one to be doing the job. And also peer reviews. Seems to be a very popular pattern from S3, where people lead in inviting others to come and offer feedback along with themselves on what's going well and what can be improved, building it into development plans, co-creating development plans, and then, acting on the outcome. Doing. I'm not going to say much about doing because I've learned just about everything there is to learn about I'm so sorry about this. Doing. See, that's my critic and my pleaser and my responsible self who's saying, what's going on? Doing. Okay, I learned almost everything there is to know about organizing work effectively from Agile and Lean. So, identifying, distributing work, prioritizing backlogs, pulling in work rather than pushing work, and reviewing and improving. So, a natural outgrowth of all of these practices, and these are just a few from S3, is participation. Because when people have a sense of ownership over what's happening and what they're doing, they naturally feel more engaged and more accountable. So it's not, in my experience, something that we have to focus on per se. If you can address agility, if you can address decision-making and doing the work, then participation improves by itself. Simply through people being able to contribute, build collaboration, and learn together. And one final thing I wanted to talk about in this kind of brief presentation around S3 is artful participation. Because for me, in general, before S3 and before deciding to call it this was probably one of the most challenging and yet simple patterns for anybody to pick up. And it's basically just by asking yourself the question, is my behavior in this moment really the best contribution I can make to the effectiveness of our collaboration? Is how I'm interacting with my beloved right now really the most effective or greatest contribution I can make to the well-being of our relation? Is how I'm interacting with my child right now the greatest contribution I can make to the well-being of him, myself, the future? And if not, what might I do differently right now? If not, what do I realize? What have I become conscious of? What habitual patterns and strategies am I running on here? And are they really life-serving in this moment? which can include interrupting, holding back, and my personal favorite, breaking agreements. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just say, no, I ain't gonna do that. So, let's not break this down. I intend to share this presentation with you so you can take a look, but I wanted to kind of pull together these 4 dimensions, and you can see the different ways in which patterns from S3 are helping to facilitate more performance, more alignment, but also more fulfillment and well-being in organizations. And what I'd like to do now is kind of head back to wrap things up, kind of finishing on a similar topic to how we started. Life's agile, no? And we call it agility, and it's like this newfangled mindset stuff. But life is agile. Life is decentralized. Yeah, there's influence happening all over the place. And yet somehow, miraculously, there's some kind of systemic alignment. And we're life. So by virtue of the definition, it probably follows that in us we have the wisdom of agility because our systems are agile. So what stands in the way of us creating agile human systems? I mean at scale, I see like super agile teams, but honestly most of them are silos. There's often tensions between them, there's dependencies between them. I'm generalizing, maybe you have a different experience, but often so. And then on the other end, as the organization grows, there's a radically hierarchical business end, and some kind of weather front in the middle, and it's moving, it's changing. But we haven't really figured out in most situations how to facilitate agility at scale as human beings. And I think it's helpful for us to recognize, it was helpful for me to recognize, let me put it like that I was behaving in the ways I did for a really good reason. And I'm guessing you behave in the ways you do for really good reasons. They might not be relevant anymore. And maybe some of it is just habit. Yeah. So even though we behave for good reasons, it's not necessarily reasonable. But understanding alone is not enough. We need compassion. Compassion for ourselves and compassion for one another, because we're really doing our best in an extremely complex context. We are life discovering itself. And just because everybody's doing it every day, we could think, oh, I'm just another person and I should try harder. But honestly, it's like, what a miracle. Have you stopped to reflect what's happening recently? Isn't it amazing to be? So, primary selves, they don't let go of anything until there's more viable ways integrated. If anyone here is banging on the door of people in positions of power and authority, remember this. Primary selves don't let go of anything until there's more viable ways integrated, or until the system collapses. And sometimes this is what happens instead, of course. All behavior and all organizations exist to serve human needs. Not all organizations exist to serve all human needs. And I don't have a evaluative opinion on that. I just think it's good we know what we're serving. But what I do see is that the higher the level of fulfillment for people, the greater the amount of meaning people get from what they do in their short, precious lives, the higher the engagement, accountability, innovation, general awesomeness people co-create together. We're co-authoring a story. We can take the power position over others. We can collude with that drama and take our positions as victims. I do it myself on a regular basis. We can make a business trying to save other people, talk them down and lift them up. There's a positive aspect to this. We are potent co-creative beings. We are profoundly vulnerable, and we can be extremely responsive. And these three in consciousness together is empowerment, power in service of vulnerability. And generally, for most of us, we are in the privileged position of being free. We have decided our lives and decided who we shall be and what we shall do, even though it may not be fully conscious that we did that. And the challenge is that freedom and awesomeness at scale requires a collective choice. I can't just make it happen for myself. You know, for us to be free and awesome together, we have to do something together. And frustratingly, sometimes maybe, transformation can only happen one person at a time. It's beyond me why people transform. Some do, and some just follow the grind their whole lives. But one thing's for sure, I don't think anybody's coming to save us. I suspect that we are the ones we've been waiting for. This is both profoundly good news, because it means we can do something about it, and it's profoundly bad news, because it means we need to do something about it. And the children of tomorrow shall surely inherit the consequence of our actions or inactions, as much as we did those that came before. I'm James. Thank you for your time. Yeah.